Hi everybody. Welcome at the I3h seminar. Very happy to welcome you today. We have a discussion with Professor Dr. Ariel Stern, and she's the Alexander von Humboldt Professor for Digital Health Economics and Policy at the Hasso-Plattner Institute and a full professor at the University of Potsdam and the I3h Department of Artificial Intelligence and Human Health (ICAN) at School of Medicine Mount Sinai. She focuses on technology management and innovation in healthcare, considering the regulation, strategy, and economics of healthcare, with a focus on emerging healthcare technologies and delivery modalities. Today, she's also a member of the Scientific Advisory Board for the German Society for Digital Medicine and the Max Planck Institute for Innovation and Competition, and advises numerous health care startups. It was I3h research fellow Sofia Amaral Garcia who brought us in contact with Professor Ariel Stern, wherefore Sofia would like to thank you. Professor Stern will present to us today the regulation of artificial intelligence as a medical device. Professor Stern, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. And thank you to all of you for the lovely invitation, of course, especially to Sophia for putting us in touch. It's wonderful to present and to meet all of you. A few things, as usual, this talk will be available as a recording afterwards. If there's anything that you need or you didn't catch, I'm also happy to provide a copy of the slides to anyone who's interested. And of course, I will talk about several different published papers as I go. And if you'd like a copy of any of these papers, I can either provide them directly or I can provide them to the I3h Institute team to distribute to anyone who's interested. I won't have time to go into every single detail about every single paper because I want to get everyone on to the rest of their day on time, but all of this can be readily available after the fact. I'm going to start by briefly telling you about myself and my research and how this all fits in, and then I'll share a few things that are a combination of recent publications and in particular a book chapter that I published early in 2024 about regulated medical AI, and I've updated a couple of the graphs for you as well so that you can see where we're going with all of this. And of course, if you talk about AI as a medical device, we also need to talk about software as a medical device. So I'll start there and then I'll move into AI, which is really just a special case of medical device software. So with that introduction, I promised just 2 slides about what I do. So my background is in applied healthcare economics and data science. And I very broadly study biomedical innovations that have only existed at some point since this century. So these are things including but not limited to precision medicine, healthcare IT, and digital health. And the research that I do has a natural, translational, and interdisciplinary focus. I work closely with physicians, with data scientists, and with law professors, which is a lot of fun. I know this is an interdisciplinary group as well. So I share that tidbit on purpose. I care about a data-driven understanding of the economic and managerial underpinnings of the translation and commercialization of this century's most crucial healthcare advancements. This, of course, includes AI, but is not limited to it. The topics I work on, there are sort of 5 big buckets that you could put my research into. So innovation in medical devices and medical software, the economics of precision medicines, targeted therapeutics, and biopharmaceuticals, the digital transformation of clinical research and practice. So clinical trials and how digital health technologies are changing how we bring medicines to market, the regulation and adoption of digital health technologies, and finally, AI in healthcare. Today, I will really only talk about 1, 4, and 5. So as teasered in the topic of this talk, I won't spend so much time on these other areas, but if this is something you're interested in, we regularly have visiting and full-time doctoral students visiting and full-time postdocs and affiliated researchers with my lab at the Hasso-Plattner Institute. So if any of this resonates with you, also feel free to reach out. Okay, so let's talk about AI in health and medicine. I think it's difficult to open a newspaper or any publication these days and not hear about somebody using AI in healthcare for something. And I want to kind of say what we're talking about. So there are of course, wonderful and very exciting applications, and we've seen real advancements just in recent years of AI in basic science. These are things like understanding protein folding, some of the work that Google DeepMind has done recently, and then translational science. And this is where we think about the pharmaceutical industry typically being involved. So this is, everything from helping to discover new drug candidates to design new molecules. There's a lot of AI being used to design new small molecule drugs in oncology, for example, for screening patients during clinical research, but also other aspects of translational science, AI tools that simply help us make it easier to recruit patients for clinical trials or accelerate other operational aspects of drug R&D. Then there are a bunch of applications that help us improve existing digital tools that we already have. Just one example here is we use a lot of software when we interpret whole genome sequence data. But the way that whole genome sequencing works is you have to chop up the DNA into lots of little pieces and then sequence the little bits and then put it back together to understand the genome. This process results in gaps throughout the genome. And what AI can help us do is do a better job of imputing missing information in these types of contexts, which make the quality of many of our large genomic data sets even better just by using AI tools to improve data quality. And then finally, what we will be focusing on today, and this is why I listed everything else first, are a set of tools that actually support healthcare delivery, the actual provision of healthcare to patients. So this could be in outpatient contexts, this could be in hospitals or in clinics. And here we really only have, and I'll show you another chart about this in a moment, we really only have three big buckets of information, or three big buckets, three big settings in which we can apply AI in healthcare delivery. So there's administrative work, diagnosis, and treatment. And I'll tell you more about this shortly. But that's really it. So if you think about what you can use AI for in hospitals, in clinics, it's typically falls into one of these three categories. And we can use the AI tool set, so tools from machine learning and natural language processing for research itself. And some of the research that I talk about today will be doing just this. So we'll actually be taking tools from AI or just applied data science to understand things like text data in the healthcare context. So I promised to talk about medical devices. So I want to talk about the digital revolution in healthcare and in medical devices in particular. So medical devices themselves, and I'll give you the formal definition on the next slide in both the United States and the European Union. But medical devices are this very heterogeneous category that include a wide range of medical products that you typically don't ingest or inject. What do these look like? So these devices can be analog. So that is, there's no digital component, no software either included in the product or that the product interfaces with. These could be very simple catheters used, in every hospital in the world, hundreds of times per day. Or these could be very complex, high-risk medical devices, things like drug-eluting coronary artery stents. Medical devices could also be digital. So insulin pumps that type 1 diabetics use, implantable heart failure monitors. I don't know if you're familiar with this technology. This product on the very right is a CardioMEMS device. That tiny little piece on the upper left of the image is actually implanted in a patient's heart, and it measures pressure within the heart. Why is that interesting? For patients who have heart failure, and who are at risk of decompensation, there's actually a precipitous drop in heart pressure before the patient decompensates. And so this device can actually measure that change in pressure, send a signal to the external device, and alert the patient to get to the hospital. In this device, there are now a number of very high quality studies, including RCT level evidence, that have shown that this device actually saves lives because it helps to prevent deaths from the consequences of heart failure. So this is all very exciting. These devices, of course, on the right don't work without software. The devices on the left do. And that leads to our next point, which is in addition to these software-hardware combination products, which are the two on the right, which we call SIMD or software in medical devices, We also have something that's very difficult to picture because it's truly just code, it's just software, which is standalone software that meets the legal definition of a medical device. And this is called SaMD, or software as a medical device. And I will give you, there's actually an internationally accepted definition of this term, and I will show you this shortly. So very briefly, I promised a transatlantic definition of medical devices. What are they? So in the United States, we define medical devices. So I'm German American. I'll tell you a bit about both. We define medical devices as an instrument, apparatus, implement, machine, contrivance, implant, in vitro reagent, or other similar article. It's intended for use in the diagnosis of disease or other conditions, or in the cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease, and which is not dependent on being metabolized for the achievement of any of its principal intended purposes. So again, sort of back to my casual definition, medical products that you do not ingest or inject. In the European Union, we have a definition that is so broad as to be unhelpful sometimes. We just say that medical devices are products or equipment intended generally for a medical use. So, very broadly, I think you get the sense of what I'm talking about. So how do we actually regulate these things? So on the other side of the Atlantic, I think most of our attendees, just given the time and the audience, are in Europe, but I will be looking at some US data in this talk, so I'll tell you a bit about the United States. The current system in the United States was enshrined in an act of the US Congress from 1976 when the Medical Device Amendments were passed. This augmented the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and basically gave the US federal government legal authority to regulate medical devices. Until the mid-1970s, medical devices were actually regulated by the individual states in the United States. And there were some quite serious public health issues, including some patient deaths from malfunctioning medical devices. And at the time, it's difficult to believe when one looks at the current environment in the United States, but at the time there was this big public outcry for more federal government regulation of medical products to ensure patient safety. The medical device amendments, so since the 1976, the United States has 3 classes of devices. So they're class 1 devices. These are low risk things. So things like tongue depressors, stethoscopes. These are devices that we have to have certified that they're going to be manufactured in a factory, in a facility where the facility itself has been certified by the US FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. But there's no formal regulatory authorization process necessary. And this makes sense for our lowest risk medical. These also include things like latex gloves, condoms, feminine hygiene products. We want these products to be manufactured in clean facilities, but we don't actually need to submit some sort of clinical evidence or even bench testing evidence that latex gloves work the way we expect them to. Then we go into moderate risk devices in class 2 and class 3. So these are moderate and high risk devices. These do require regulatory authorization. Legally speaking, in the United States, class 2 devices are cleared for marketing and only class 3 devices are approved for marketing. So we have to be careful about language. Class 2 or moderate risk devices, these are things like hearing aids, CT scanners. They bear certainly some risk, and malfunction could cause significant problems for patients, but malfunctioning of these devices is very unlikely to cause irreparable damage or death of patients. And then class 3 devices, these are devices of the highest risk. These are devices that are typically implantable and or life-sustaining. These are things like pacemakers, the coronary stent I showed you earlier. These are devices where we want to have great confidence, including typically from inpatient trials, that these devices are safe and effective before we put them into people. And so only class 3 devices are typically or necessarily regulated through a process that involves evidence from clinical trials. Many class 2 devices will, especially the newest class 2 devices, will either of their own accord or be asked by regulators to submit some clinical evidence. But it's really only going to be necessary for the class 3 devices. Class 2 devices are able in many cases to operate based on a principle of substantial equivalence, which basically means that if the manufacturer can argue that a device is substantially equivalent to another medical device that is already being safely marketed. A new clinical trial, for example, is not going to be necessary. All right. Over to the EU, back on the other side of the Atlantic. So in the EU, each country actually did its own thing until 1990. And we had, as is the case in many other areas, not just of health and medicine, but in society, a real patchwork of policies and institutions in Europe. Today, we have something called CE marks that are valid throughout Europe. In Europe, we define 4 classes of medical devices that are based on increasing risk. The regulation itself is overseen by a government body called a competent authority. So, for example, in France, you would have the French Agency for the Safety of Health Products. And the lowest risk devices, this is quite similar to what you see in the United States, are declared to the competent authority, and they may conduct manufacturing inspections and review the technical file, but they're not going to go through such a rigorous regulatory authorization process. The authorization or approval for more complex devices is directly handled by a decentralized system of notified bodies. Every European country has its own. Their decisions are reciprocally recognized. So a French notified body will always recognize a CE mark from a German notified body and vice versa. These are independent companies that specialize in evaluation of all sorts of consumer products, including but not limited to medical devices. What we have today are 2 regulations, the MDR, so the Medical Device Regulation, and I3h, the In Vitro Diagnostics Regulation, that came into force kind of during and just after the acute part of the COVID pandemic and replaced the 3 previous existing directives based on which we were regulating medical devices in Europe up until this point. All right. Let me stop there. If there aren't any questions, I'll keep going. Again, this is all just reference information. The similarities that you should keep in mind is that on both sides of the Atlantic, we have a set of risk classes. The real difference with Europe is that instead of just one large bucket of class 2 or moderate risk medical devices, we actually split that up into class 2A and class 2B. So sort of lower moderate risk and higher moderate risk devices. And I'll leave it at that. And I want to come back to the point that we were talking about earlier, which is around medical device software, because of course, software is a necessary but not sufficient condition for incorporating AI into these medical devices. So I promised you a formal definition. The term software as a medical device, you may have heard SAMD, which is how it's pronounced out loud, is defined by the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. That's a real thing. So all of our medical device regulators worldwide, they get together once a year, they have a big conference, and they write definitions and help us to harmonize terminology. This is a wonderful thing because that means that when we talk about a certain type of device in Europe, we're talking about the same thing, not only within Europe, but in different countries as well. And it's a great help for manufacturers, but also for regulators. For the manufacturers, it means that a coronary artery stent in Europe is the same as a coronary artery stent in the United States or Canada or Brazil. And for regulators, it also makes it much easier to think about how can we be thoughtful about sharing data? How can data submitted from a clinical trial in Brazil be relevant for regulators in the United States? So this definition is that it's software that's intended to be used for one or more medical purposes that perform these purposes without being part of a hardware medical device. So this is not the insulin pump I showed you earlier. Rather, this is standalone software that on its own meets the definition of a medical device. What that means is this is software that can be run on different machines. It's software that, a great example is a piece of software that can interpret data from a CT scan. And it doesn't matter which type of CT scanner was used, the output files are in a standardized format. The software takes those output files of the CT scanner, inputs it into an algorithm, and then uses that algorithm to make, for example, a diagnosis recommendation. So this standalone software itself meets the definition of a medical device because remember, we said a medical device is something that's going to be involved in diagnosing or supporting treatment of a patient. And if the software is making these types of recommendations for diagnosis or treatment, then it's going to meet the definition of a medical device. We also have software in a medical device, and these are the examples I showed you earlier. This is software that is integral to a medical device. This is software that is physically and literally inextricable from the medical device itself. It's the software that powers not the insulin pump, but also the software that powers any piece of radiology equipment you could imagine. So the software that powers the CT scanner or the MRI machine is software in a medical device. Whereas a standalone piece of software, a standalone algorithm that takes the output of that CT scan or that MRI and makes a diagnosis would be software as a medical device. And then just a quick note, not all applications will be regulated. There will be a bunch of administrative functions, which I'll talk about shortly, that do not meet the definition of a medical device, so they're definitely out. But there are also a few edge cases. So in the United States, tools that are directly embedded in electronic health records used in hospitals are often able to circumvent regulation due to sort of some complexities of how the law is written, as well as lab-developed tests. These are diagnostic tests that are developed specifically for one laboratory, so one facility. So a hospital or a health system may develop its own version of a test, and that too can circumvent a formal medical device regulatory process if that test is not being designed to be sold outside of that hospital or health system. We can talk about that in the comments later, but there are a few technical exceptions, fewer in Europe. Okay, so what's been happening in the industry? I brought some data with me today just to sort of show you the scale of what we're talking about. So these are data that we scraped from the FDA's website. I would have loved to show you versions of these pictures for Europe with European data. Unfortunately, we don't have access to centralized data at scale in Europe the same way we do in the United States. In the United States, however, software is not being tracked. Why is that the case, you may wonder? Well, the FDA databases that contain information about moderate risk and high risk medical devices date back to the late 1990s. And in the late 1990s, it simply didn't occur to regulators to create a field in these databases for whether or not a piece of medical technology incorporates software. So what does that mean? That means that if I were to ask an employee of the FDA, today or last year, how many medical devices did you approve in the past year that includes software, someone from a given division might be able to make an educated guess. Someone from the cardiovascular devices division might say, oh, well, I think it was a couple dozen, or this or that. But there's no way to actually account for this in the data that are published. So what did we do? A former postdoc of mine, Alex Everhart, who's now a professor at the University of Washington in St. Louis, he and I, along with our colleague and data scientist, Melissa Oulet, we scraped a bunch of data from medical device product summaries and just went and looked for keywords. We initially did a version of this project that was a bit more sophisticated, where we said, okay, we're going to actually take these large blocks of text and we're going to send them to the medical text indexer. The medical text indexer is an algorithm from the US National Library of Medicine that helps to assign medical keywords to pieces of medical text. This is how the keywords for all of our medical journal articles are assigned these days. They're no longer assigned by human librarians, they're assigned by an algorithm. However, it turns out that you can do an even better job just focusing on simple keywords. And the reason is, in typical medical device product summaries, you don't use the word software unless the device actually contains software. So it sounds trivial once you say it out loud, but there's just no reason that a manufacturer would write a sentence that says, oh, by the way, this artificial knee implant doesn't contain any software. So what that means is there are no false positives when you actually look for keywords like software in these product summaries. What that allows us to do at scale is actually just scan, in this case, about 42,000 medical device product summaries and look for the incidence and the frequency of keywords. Here we'll just focus on whether or not these are software products. What you see here in this graph, on the y-axis, you see the years, and on the left axis, you see the number of newly authorized digital devices in that year. So this is not cumulative. This is in a given year. what were the total number of new medical devices that came to market that had software components. And recall, this is, a necessary but not sufficient condition for incorporating AI. If you interpret that top line, that's radiology devices, what you see is that in recent years, plus or minus 400 unique medical devices per year were cleared for authorization that had some sort of software component. You can also do this as a share of total medical devices. So you might say, oh, well, like maybe there are just many more medical devices today than there were 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. But here too, if you look at the total share of devices that contain software, you again see similar patterns, which is just this upward linear trend over time. Note, it is not a hockey stick. It's not an explosion when we look at the digital transformation of medical devices, but it's absolutely growth over time. Again, the top line here is radiology. And here that you can see in recent years, upwards of 95%, so 0.95 as a share of all radiology devices have been digital in recent years. This shouldn't surprise anyone who spends time studying radiology. Radiology was by far the first medical specialty area to be digitized or digitally transformed. And therefore, if anything, it should surprise us these days to see a radiology device that doesn't either have or interact with software. I'll show you just a couple more pictures before we continue. I talked previously about software as a medical device versus software in a medical device. So we still see much more integrated software. This is the SIMD than standalone software, the SAMD. So SIMD here is software in medical devices. These are the devices with embedded software. These are quite large numbers. I have deliberately kept the y-axis the same so that you can see here that software as a medical device, the standalone algorithms, and this is really where most of the AI action is happening. Software as a medical device has absolutely grown in the last decade in particular, but is still nowhere near the scale of other medical device software that we see. Let me pause there and make sure we don't have any questions.
Mark, you had a question with respect to orphan medical devices.
We can also take it later.
Mark, we don't hear you.
I'm happy to keep going and then we can circle back to it. How does that sound?
Maybe, well, I can read his question
Sure.
that we don't hear. EU regulation on orphan medical devices is in preparation. Will this include the software?
Yeah, so these are US data, but absolutely. So there's no reason that, and here too, so in the United States, much like in Europe, there are quite similar regulatory programs for things like priority medical device review, orphan products. What we are looking at here is the totality of all authorized medical devices in these specialty areas. To the extent there are some orphan devices in here, I imagine there would be, these would be captured by this data. But this is right now only US data simply because making graphs like this is not yet possible with European data. Although I look forward to a time when it is, obviously, as the type of person who does this research. Okay, I'm going to show you one more picture. And that's that we have a growing number of unique products. So this is the first graph that actually is cumulative. And here what you see over time is the cumulative number of digital product codes. Product codes in the United States are unique types of products. A product code represents a group of medical devices that are very good to excellent substitutes for one another. So this could be a drug-eluting coronary artery stent. I will not get up in front of you and argue that all drug-eluting coronary artery stents are identical to one another. Interventional cardiologists, of course, have their preferences and their reasons for using different devices, either in general or in certain circumstances. However, it represents a certain type of medical device that's largely comparable. And what you see here is that if you look at the different number of product codes, the number of unique types of medical devices, you see that the cumulative count of those different types of medical devices has also been growing over time. So it's not the case that we are simply just coming up with new versions of digital blood pressure cuffs. Digital blood pressure cuff only gets counted once in this graph. What that means is that over time, we are not just commercializing more digital medical devices, but commercializing more different types of digital medical devices. And you can see here that now, rather than radiology, the leading category, at least in recent years, it's goes back and forth between clinical chemistry, which is where all of the diagnostic tests are, and cardiovascular devices, where we have something around 100. By the end of last year, there were about 150 unique different types of cardiovascular devices that had been digitized or were natively digital. And of course, within each of these categories, there may be multiple different manufacturers of that type of device. So this, I think the combination of these three slides tells you a bit about, the digital revolution or the digital transformation of the medical device industry. Why does this matter? So this is an article that I published with Will Gordon, who's a longtime co-author of mine. Back in 2019, we have, I think, a quick comment about algorithms and AI in this paper, but this was actually before we were thinking too much about AI. Will and I published this article in Nature Biomedical Engineering, calling out the unique challenges and opportunities associated with putting software into medical devices. There are a bunch of software-specific challenges, and I'll just run through these quickly. The first is the dynamic software development process. So the way we develop software is an ongoing process. The software, as many of you have a device that looks like this, that's not very far from you or in your pocket right now. Your mobile phones are receiving regular software updates. The computers that many of you are watching this seminar on are also receiving regular software updates. This is not how we typically and historically have developed medical products. Think about traditional therapeutics, pharmaceutical products, or also even traditional medical devices. We spend a lot of time developing new materials for orthopedic implants. We do extensive lab testing, bench testing, animal testing. We run clinical trials to make sure that those devices work as intended in patients. But we would never then just go ahead and make changes to the device once it's been cleared for marketing. But that's exactly what we do when we maintain software. The same thing goes for drugs. Of course, once you've gone through the process of doing 3 phases of clinical trials and bringing a new drug to market, you can't just change the molecule. We know that we often get extended release versions of certain drugs that may be related molecules. You still have to do you still have to do some more clinical research to demonstrate the safety and efficacy of those products. But software is developed and maintained dynamically. So there's a real mismatch here. It wasn't until earlier this century that it was even possible to make software updates for safety-related reasons, even when there were sort of known problems with software. And then the FDA quickly stepped in when this became clear and said, no, we're going to, of course, allow manufacturers to make improvements to software, especially when it affects patient safety. Distribution issues are another real challenge. So this is another thing that sounds trivial once you say it, but software is not typically distributed through medical supply chains. The way we distribute software these days is almost entirely through the cloud. But how we get medical devices, actual medical products, into our hospitals and clinics is a separate process related to medical distribution and medical distribution supply chains. How do we think about medical devices that are software and getting those into the places where they belong? There's a mismatch with our distribution channels. We talked quite a bit about the difference between hardware dependent versus hardware agnostic devices. There are, in both cases, slightly different challenges around accountability and safety testing. I'll give you just one example. A hardware agnostic medical device. So that means a SAMD product, software as a medical device. That's the standalone software. The standalone software example I gave you is that an algorithm may take the output of a CT scan and then make a diagnostic recommendation based on that. Well, who is accountable for the fact that one manufacturer's CT scanner may have some sort of issue and produce a low quality image such that the diagnostic algorithm, simply because of bad image quality, is not able to actually observe whatever malignancy or problem it should be observing. Who is accountable there? The manufacturer of the algorithm didn't do anything wrong, but the algorithm itself, that software, will come to the wrong diagnosis. And so we have these interesting challenges related to accountability when the image that's being generated, whether that's a radiology image or a pathology image or another piece of data, is of low enough quality that the software can't do its job. Cybersecurity and privacy, of course, are massive issues. These are significant with any medical device software, become even greater as we start to talk about AI, which we will continue to do. And then a bunch of odd challenges that we just simply don't have elsewhere. So questions about the longevity of the manufacturer and who's responsible for maintaining software. So if I were to receive, so my stepmother received a knee implant back in August. And if the manufacturer of her new knee, of that medical device, were to go bankrupt tomorrow, it actually probably wouldn't matter. She had a very good surgeon. She received a very high quality knee replacement device. And if that manufacturer were to cease to exist, it probably would never have any impact on my stepmother's quality of life. However, what if instead my stepmother had received an implantable device, like a pacemaker, and now the manufacturer of that pacemaker goes bankrupt? Whose responsibility is it to maintain that pacemaker software and to continue to ensure that that software is, backward and forward compatible with different operating systems and with the pacemaker itself? We run into some real challenges that we simply don't have with hardware medical devices. And then finally, payment and reimbursement models. It's difficult to overstate how challenging this is, especially for standalone software products, which we tend to distribute and think of selling in SaaS models. So this is software as a service. The way that we're used to paying for medical devices and diagnostics is not as a SaaS model or a subscription model, but rather in this very one-for-one way. So the traditional way hospitals are used to thinking about purchasing diagnostics is, I give you €5 and you give me 5 COVID tests. But this isn't how we distribute algorithms that are meant to be layered on top of all of the scans being done, for example, in a radiology department. And so thinking about how do we actually reimburse for medical software in the context of medical devices and diagnostics is a very unique challenge. That said, there are some very compelling opportunities to actually improve patient care. So problems can be fixed and products can be improved quickly and at scale. This is, I think back to my example, if that knee implant that my stepmother received had some sort of minor flaw, in her case, it will never be fixed. Or if there was some sort of minor opportunity to improve the quality of that knee implant, she will never benefit from it. However, if instead the patient has software in his or her medical device, because we can do push updates and because we can update the medical device software, it's not only future patients, but actually the entire pool of existing patients who have the opportunity to benefit from those improvements. So that's the flip side of that coin. The commoditization of hardware itself may drive down prices, indeed is already doing so in a few settings. And then all of the data that we can collect in this setting can actually support a much more meaningful transition to value-based care, as well as high-quality real-world evidence. A wonderful and exciting feature of digital medical devices is the metadata they collect. I'm working right now, my lab is working with a few manufacturers of digital therapeutics, and we can not only see patient data from the clinical trials conducted, but we can actually see the metadata. So how frequently patients are engaging with these tools, and we can measure things that have historically been exquisitely difficult to measure, things like adherence with therapeutic regimes, etc. Physiotherapy is a great example of this. If I have an injury, I go to the physiotherapist, they send me home perhaps with a few leaflets with certain exercises that I should be conducting. And perhaps a link to a few YouTube videos where I can learn about those exercises. The physiotherapist from that point on has no idea whether I'm doing my exercises, whether I'm doing my exercises correctly, whether I'm doing them at the right frequency. Whereas if instead I prescribe an app, a prescription digital health application, that application can not only coach me, and it can actually use AI feedback to ensure that I am doing my exercise correctly or as well as possible. But the app can actually measure, am I doing my exercises frequently enough and on a daily basis if is what's been recommended. So we can start to measure things and actually pay for outcomes and pay for things like adherence in ways that were not previously possible. So I think this is quite exciting. And we haven't even explicitly talked that much about AI yet. So I said early on, there are three big things we can do with AI in this setting. We can do administrative work, we can do diagnosis and a bunch of activities related to supporting diagnosis, and we can support treatment. These are some examples from a publication called How Artificial Intelligence is Changing Healthcare Delivery. We published it back in 2019. So this was, of course, before generative AI models even really existed, certainly before the public had any knowledge of them. But the categories nevertheless remain the right ones. And this is really still what we're dealing with today. So what's the rub? So within diagnosis and treatment, because of what I told you earlier, many, if not most of these applications will meet the definition of a medical device. And this intersection of AI and things that meet the definition of medical devices will have implications for innovation incentives. And this forces the hand of regulators. Because we've inherited, in the case of the United States from 1976, a definition of a medical device that is necessarily so broad that it includes anything involved in diagnosis or treatment. In Europe, it's quite similar. So, what's the challenge? I call it institutional mismatch in a lot of my writing. And here's the problem. The technology that has the greatest potential to transform healthcare, and AI is sort of high on this list, would be unrecognizable to the 20th century architects of our regulatory reimbursement and healthcare delivery institutions. What does this mean? This means that today's rapidly transforming technological and analytical capabilities, coupled with this intense pace of innovation, are actually increasingly mismatched, not just mismatched, but increasingly mismatched to our existing institutional structures. And this itself underlies many of today's challenges, also a few opportunities in the commercialization of new products like AI, medical devices, and their effective adoption in practice. So what do I want to do now? I want to sort of show you a bit about some data from the book chapter that we published early last year on this. What did we do? So this was a smaller sample than the sample I was speaking about earlier, but we actually grabbed over 36,000 medical device clearances. We ended up focusing on cardiovascular and radiology devices. The reason is that with one or two exceptions, all of the AI devices at the time we were writing this book chapter, which was back in 2023, were in the cardiovascular and radiology space. I believe there were only two exceptions in the entire FDA database. For this project, we focused on US data because European data were not available. We grabbed all the medical devices that had public documents available. We were able to, using the method I talked about earlier, identify which of those devices were digital, had a software keyword, and then we were able to, within those, say how many of these are talking about artificial intelligence. How did we do this? So a packet of information gets published every time a device is either cleared or approved for marketing. And what we did in my team is we did a mix of downloading and text scraping to understand the device origin and content. And I'll show you a bit more about the data from these medical devices as well. We've established this procedure now for identifying software devices based on the product summaries we use and extend it in this book chapter. These are just a few more screenshots about the data set, but what we can actually do here is we can start to see which keywords are used to describe these medical products. We know how many of them talk about software, algorithms, artificial intelligence, deep learning, machine learning, neural networks. We can look at which of these devices received certain regulatory designations from the US FDA. We can look at the origin of the manufacturer. So where did this application come from? Was it from the United States, since this is a US database, or was it perhaps from France or Japan or China? We can look at the firm that submitted the application. Was it a publicly listed or privately held firm? We can, among those publicly listed firms, of course, to a large extent only among the publicly listed firms. We can actually look at data on things like tax filings to understand the revenues of those firms, how many employees they had, what their R&D spending is, et cetera. And so we can get all sorts of rich data about who is commercializing AI devices. Okay, so in the United States, I told you that our current regulatory system goes back to 1976. And what we have in the book chapter are a few images that look like this. So please note here, and this is quite important, there are two different y-axes. So the orange line that looks like it's growing rather linearly, the darker line is on the leftmost y-axis. This is just the total number of software devices over time. And recall, please, that the book chapter is nearly 2 years old now, so the data are a bit older. But this line, you should just think of it as the sort of as the sum of all of those individual lines I showed you on the very first graph that we were looking at earlier, where here you see by the end of 2023, or in the year 2023, there were roughly 1,000 unique digital medical devices that came to market in the United States. On the right axis, the right y-axis, you have an order of magnitude, so much smaller numbers. But here you see AI devices. So the solid yellow line are the number of AI devices that we were able to identify based on text and keywords. And the dotted yellow line is from the FDA. So after writing the book chapter, the US FDA actually began publishing a list of what it considers to be the artificial intelligence and machine learning medical devices it has already authorized for marketing. This list is, I just saw some news, I believe it was just updated last week. You can go download it as an Excel or CSV file from the FDA's website. I encourage everyone to do so and play around with the data. But it was only after we published this book chapter, or we wrote this book chapter, that the FDA started publishing its own list. What you see is the FDA's list is actually a bit more generous than ours. Our definition is more conservative. Why is that? So several of the, not a lot, but several of the devices on the FDA's list, one or maybe 24 per year, are not in our list, and it's because we were either not able to find relevant keywords or because the FDA has quite a generous definition of AI, where they include algorithms that do logistic regression. They say that's artificial intelligence. I think many AI researchers would hesitate. That's a pretty traditional method from econometrics and regression analysis. It's not the same as using a neural network or many of the deep learning techniques that have really only come about in recent years. In any case, you get a very similar picture either way, which is sort of linear growth in the software medical devices continuing apace, and just this explosion in recent years of AI devices. And you can see a few different things that happened over time as vertical lines here. The FDA published its Digital Health Action Plan in 2017. They published a discussion paper with a proposed regulatory framework for AI and machine learning in 2019, and then an action plan in 2020. And so you can sort of see that many of these regulatory decisions coincided with really the steep part of growth of AI medical devices in the United States. Okay, so what do we take away from this? So if you just look at the data we collected for this book chapter, over half of all cardiology and radiology devices that were cleared over the period 2010 to 2021 included software. This is, as I mentioned earlier, a necessary but not sufficient condition for the incorporation of AI. Software devices in general and AI devices in particular are more likely to have a regulatory breakthrough designation. This is based on a small number of observations, but intriguing because breakthrough devices are eligible for an expedited regulatory review process. The share of AI devices that are brought to market by publicly listed firms is just about a quarter, versus nearly 40% for software devices and medical devices overall. So that tells us that AI devices are more likely than other devices to come from smaller and privately held firms. And they're also more likely to come from international applicants than either comparator group. So the AI devices are over half international versus less than half for all of the software devices, and a bit more than a third overall. And if anything, this method undercounts for technical reasons. Where do these products come from? So, you can see the outside, the United States, of course, is by far the largest. That's the bottom row. But if you look at other countries that, have large or even double-digit numbers of AI devices, this may not surprise you. It's China, it's Israel, Japan. Close to China, you also see countries like France. But we can start to get a handle on sort of where this innovation is taking place among the devices. And let's be careful, this is among the devices that actually came to market in the United States. Okay, so I want to say just a few thoughts related to this. Oh, there's a hand up. Yes, Hilda.
Yes, Ariel, I wanted to ask you with respect to the public institute. Yeah, oh, sorry. Yeah, wait, I need to. Yes. With respect to those organizations bringing, or the public organizations bringing medical devices with AI on the market, do they then, is this linked with open source codes as they
No,
are
not
public?
necessarily.
No.
No,
This,
not necessarily. No, there's sort of no. This just tells us about the identity of the firm. So if it's, if
and
it's
and do you have an idea of the rates of open source code used
very, very
versus?
little, very, very
No.
little, very, very
Okay.
little. Yeah. Um, and a lot of the medical device software, we have to sort of be careful here, is also made up of existing components. So, we're not talking about like total greenfield innovation here. And there's actually something that was being talked about quite a lot at the FDA a few years ago called a software bill of materials. And there's some exciting companies actually working in this space. It's basically, you can think about it as a recipe label for medical device software. So if you're using off-the-shelf software components in one of these medical devices, in one of these algorithms, that there's at least transparency where you say, we're using this piece of code for this function, and you can say what the components are that are going into your software medical device. So at least there's a sense of the provenance. You can imagine why this would be helpful in things like safety events. So if you realize that a piece of off-the-shelf software that's actually being used in many different radiology devices has some sort of problem in it, it allows the regulator to very quickly say, these are the 10 medical devices that use that same software component. And you can then very quickly notify the manufacturers and take remedial measures, is the idea. It's a wonderful question. Yeah. Okay. So some quick thoughts on regulatory uncertainty. So regulatory uncertainty is this notion that a manufacturer doesn't know what to expect when it goes into the regulatory clearance or approval process. And we already have evidence, among other things, from some projects I worked on about a decade ago, showing that this shapes the time spent in both approval as well as the firm composition in other innovative regulated medical devices. This example here, we see that this idea of regulatory uncertainty, when there's a lack of clarity about what the regulator is going to ask for, that leads to significant first mover disadvantages for novel high-risk medical devices. And it also means that startups and small firms are less likely to emerge as first entrants in new medical device categories. In this context, this regulatory uncertainty could matter even more. And the reason is that we already have an even greater composition of small and international innovator firms. So to the extent that regulatory uncertainty is a concern, it will be an even greater concern because we are disproportionately looking at a set of firms that are less likely to have regulatory experience at all and or in the United States. The margins of regulation will matter. This is true in the United States. This is true in Europe. What do I mean by that? So our 3 in the United States or in the EU 4 risk classes plus the accompanying regulatory pathways are somewhat arbitrary. Of course, the severity of the regulatory review is going to increase with the risk of the medical devices. But where these boundaries lie, where is the cutoff between a class 1 and a class 2 device, will matter a lot. In the United States, we already see this on both margins. There are very strong incentives for software products to be a class 2 versus a class 3 device in the United States. Similarly, we have real cases of manufacturers. I was just talking about this last week at a conference where manufacturers are actually deliberately going after less ambitious use cases for their algorithms to avoid being regulated. So if you want to go after a more ambitious use case, indeed, if you already have evidence that you can diagnose something well, but that would mean being a class 2 device and actually having to go through a more significant regulatory review. Some manufacturers and some startups say, actually, you know what, we're going to go after this easy thing. We're going to come to market as a class 1 device. That's much easier in the United States, very, very little oversight. And then we'll work on the hard part later. Why am I worried about that? Well, so first of all, I think it's a real incentive, and we see this already in anecdotes. But I think the concern for patients is that in a world where this is true and true at scale, that means that we're actually not benefiting from all of the solutions that are out there and many problems that have already been solved because manufacturers are trying to partially or fully forego dealing with regulators, and that's unfortunate for patients. And so this is another reason we might want to start thinking about how can we rethink regulation such that it is not a deterrent to actual innovation. However, I will say, regulatory strategy may be part of reimbursement strategy. In Germany, as many of you may know, we have DiGAs, which for German speakers are digitale Gesundheitsanwendungen or digital health applications. These are formal prescription digital therapeutics that are regulated and fully reimbursed by the German statutory health insurance system. Now in Germany, we have over 50 that are fully reimbursable in the statutory health insurance system. And going through a regulatory process is a requirement for being reimbursable. So in certain contexts and certain corners of the industry, this may not only be unavoidable, but part of the strategy of bringing a product to market. And then unregulated applications, the examples I mentioned earlier of clinical decision support software that's embedded in electronic health records and these lab-developed tests will almost certainly blossom, but they'll be subject to greater legal liability because they are not regulated. Okay, so where does this take us? So, this is, thinking back to my 10 years as a business school professor, we have plenty of data that shows that we see in healthcare and elsewhere, we see innovation and commercialization happening more often in settings where we have limited barriers that are either expected or experienced in regulation and in business models, and that we see adoption of these technologies is going to be successful when the tools themselves can fit into, enhance, or improve existing payment models and workflows within our healthcare system. And this is an expert audience. That last sentence certainly shouldn't surprise anybody here today. So what do we need? How do we deal with that? I personally argue that we need both public policy and business model innovation to go beyond the current systems, not just one or the other, but both. We need smart and new regulatory and public policy. As I've said now several times, we've inherited our regulatory and other institutions in healthcare from the last century, and they're just simply not perfectly aligned with the types of things we'd like to do today. Oh, there's a comment. There's something in the chat. Should I take a pause? Oops. I'll keep going, and then I can grab the chat in a moment. I'm poor at multitasking. There are examples of what good policy innovation may look like. We also need new business models and new reimbursement incentives. We need new types of contracts and mechanisms for paying for quality in health, not just for care and for more stuff, but can we do better outcomes-based and quality-based reimbursement? We need to focus on products that have very clear value for patients and or practitioners. So, what is this software product doing to improve care for my patients and or for the healthcare providers that are providing care for those patients? All sorts of technologies that can support remote care, both diagnosis and treatment, operations, administrative work, and novel clinical trial designs, I find very exciting. And then integration with clinical workflows. An amazing technology that is totally disconnected from what actually happens in the hospital is unlikely to be adopted and used, even if it's a great piece of technology, if it's completely divorced from what doctors are doing when they're providing, nurses and other healthcare professionals are doing when they're providing care to patients, it will be a real uphill battle. It will be, if not impossible, then at least quite difficult to actually incorporate technologies that we can't integrate with the workflows that already exist. Because hospitals are also institutions that we've inherited from the last century. The way a hospital is organized looks remarkably similar to what was the case 100 years ago. A doctor time traveling from 100 years ago could go into a university hospital in Berlin and walk through the front door and look at the directory, and perhaps with the exception of the IT department, actually recognize just about everything happening in that hospital. They would see, oh, there's the labor and delivery unit, there's radiology, there's pathology, there's a nursing station. So our hospitals and our clinical care is organized at a high level, much in the same way it has been for a century. And that's part of the reason that clinical workflows are so vitally important, because they're quite sticky. Okay, so I want to tell you briefly the sort of the last big thing I want to do today is give you just an example of what interesting business model innovation looks like. I want to say one thing about policy innovation, and then we can use whatever time remains for discussion. But again, this is our second to last thing. I want to tell you about a case that I wrote. So I was faculty at Harvard Business School until last year. The last case I published while I was at Harvard Business School was about a company called I3h. And they were building AI for hospitals and for radiology departments in particular. Why did I choose this example? Why did I bring this example with me today? We won't have time to do a complete discussion of the case, of course, but a quick overview of the company. They're a medical imaging company that specializes in AI solutions for radiology. They developed software that's designed to assist radiologists by analyzing medical images such as CT scans, MRI, and X-rays. This technology that they have supports the rapid detection of acute conditions like strokes, pulmonary embolisms, and intracranial hemorrhages, and improves diagnosis speed and accuracy for radiologists and radiology departments. Why is this so powerful? Well, the solution is actually integrated into hospital workflows to enhance decision-making and patient outcomes. So I have no equity in this company. I've met some of the executive team. They're lovely to talk to, but I have no horse in this race. I do think that AI in radiology is very clearly where the future is heading. And so what did AI Doc do right so far? I have no idea, like I said, where this company will end up. This is the slide that I showed you earlier. I said we see innovation and commercialization where we have limited barriers, either expected or experienced, in regulation and business models. Well, this company invested very heavily in regulatory at the time the case was written, and still today. This was the manufacturer with the most FDA-cleared algorithms of any manufacturer. So taking regulations seriously and investing in doing that right. The software itself has the ability to integrate entirely and directly into existing healthcare technology stacks. Another way of saying this, if you look, I suspect many of you are clinicians yourselves. Nobody wants another app. Nobody wants to open another window. Nobody wants another workflow. The technologies that we are already seeing being the most successful in inpatient and outpatient settings are those technologies that are directly embedded in clinical workflows. So I3h sold initially to radiology departments and then all the way to the C-suite of the hospital, which was a thoughtful decision of aligning their business model first with what's needed in radiology and then with the hospital more broadly. And how did they improve existing payment models and workflows? Well, the team started off by spending lots of time in hospitals and just observing what was going on. And there's this quote in the case that we wrote that says from the CEO of the company. It said, "I learned that AI was not really about AI. Instead, it was about how to implement process changes to help people." And I think this quote, which I enjoyed at the time, is one that I keep coming back to, because every time I talk to a hospital or a healthcare provider locally, they, at the point when an institution or an individual decides to start using AI, the challenge is not overcoming the willingness to use AI. The challenge is actually how to do process change, how to make sure that that product actually makes it into into the clinic, and that the processes around it are appropriately managed. And they built what they've described as a zero-click, always-on platform. So the user of this platform, the radiologist, does not have to open another window, doesn't have to do anything. This software is so integrated into the workflows happening in the clinic that it's always in the background. And this is really the type of AI that we think of as being the most user-friendly, because you don't have to go to a different monitor, a different window, a different app, a different piece of software to ask your question. It's right there in what is happening. Anyhow, so this is just sort of, what does the software do? It helps prioritize cases, provide contextual information, track progress, and help with follow-ups, and support care coordinations. These are exactly the types of things when many of you who work on supporting improvements in healthcare delivery more broadly, these are exactly the types of things that we think are likely to help drive the efficiency and quality of healthcare delivery. I deliberately, for this slide, it's not what does the AI do, it's what does the software do. The AI is just a very small part of this. The software itself is actually just an opportunity to provide more care coordination and better quality guidance for clinicians in how to manage their patients. I'll conclude by talking about what did ADOC do? They decided to become a platform. So, each of the individual algorithms they have, we can think of as a point solution. So it's one algorithm to detect one specific medical condition. These were always a hard sell. So these were always just difficult to sell to hospitals, because a hospital does not want to go out and subscribe to one algorithm for diagnosing subcranial hemorrhage and a different algorithm for diagnosing spinal fractures. This is very tricky. Historically, it's been difficult. Now these point solutions, these one-off diagnostic tests, are really dead in the water. And so after building out their own product offerings, ADOC decided to actually develop a marketplace for third-party algorithms. So now what they do is they sell to hospitals, and they sell hospitals a subscription that includes a suite of not only their own homegrown, home-developed regulated algorithms, but also validated regulated algorithms from other manufacturers, as a way of aggregating all of the possible tools that could be relevant for, in this case, radiology departments in one place, and making it one-stop shopping and a much more integrated procurement decision for hospitals than buying a bunch of different point solutions. These are just some questions, some food for thought. What do you think of this approach? What are the associated risks or opportunities? There are other companies like this doing similar things in Europe. Deep Sea is a great example. They're based in Munich. They actually visited us at the Hasso-Plattner Institute earlier this year. Similarly, integrating diagnostic algorithms in the radiology space. We can ask questions like, well, would this work, or which aspects of this would work in other diagnostics, under what circumstances? I don't think we have time to go into this today, but these are some interesting questions to ponder. More recently, just a couple of months ago, so over the summer, ADOC received additional funding to build its own foundation models. So really sort of taking AI seriously. And then even more recently, they received a regulatory designation, so an FDA breakthrough device designation for a first-of-a-kind solution that will actually span numerous acute conditions in CT. Okay, so the last thing I told you I wanted to talk about today is this notion of regulatory or policy innovation. Why do I want to talk about this? So when we use the word innovation in discussions of biomedical R&D, it's almost always in the context of product or process innovation. But what I like to remind people of is that there's this other type of innovation that plays a decisive role in shaping biomedicine and health, and that's innovation in the public policies that shape which products are brought to market and when. And this is another area of my research. I told you I had these other two areas I focus on that I won't be able to talk about today. I'll just do one slide about these. We need to think about this type of innovation too. I've previously looked at things like the FDA's breakthrough therapy designation for new pharmaceutical products. And in past work, we've shown in multiple peer-reviewed studies that it's possible to use better regulatory policy to actually drive efficiencies in R&D. So without changing anything related to the quality or the requirements of clinical evidence for bringing new drugs to market, we can nevertheless drive efficiencies by having more thoughtful and more innovative regulatory policies. And this is where I hope we will soon head in the context of medical device software and AI for medical devices in particular. Most recently, just last month, we published a short perspective article asking this rather controversial question: is it time or is it overdue that we rethink about how we certify medical AI? So this was the article. It was published in November in JAMA Internal Medicines, the Journal of the American Medical Association Internal Medicine, where we sort of had this intriguing title, Software as a Medical Practitioner. So this is a play on the expression software as a medical device. Is it time to license artificial intelligence? So are there settings, not every setting, but are there settings under which, rather than thinking about certifying algorithms as medical devices, should we think about basically borrowing from the concept of medical licensure to think about how to certify AI systems? So these are large AI systems. They're not just algorithms for diagnosing one thing like subcranial hemorrhage. These are algorithms that have the ability to do many, many different things. Much like a doctor, we have one table in this article where we simply point out, and we didn't have space in this to go into detail, but we simply point out that there are many ideas from the concept of medical licensure, how we actually license doctors and nurses, that we could borrow for thinking about how to license or something similar generative artificial intelligence. There are a bunch of pre-licensure requirements. You could think about appropriate licensure requirements, for medical doctors. You have to pass a medical licensing exam. You have to graduate from medical school. You need a medical degree. What does an appropriate prerequisite look like for a generative AI model? What is the scope of practice? So what are you allowed to do and what are you not allowed to do? This, depends on your seniority. It depends on the actual degree you have. It depends on many different things. We can borrow, their institutional credentialing. We can think about, how hospitals do credentialing and borrow ideas there for when and under which circumstances we could use algorithms. In medical licensure, we have a whole bunch of policies and procedures related to continuing oversight of clinicians. There too, we could borrow some of these ideas to think about continuing oversight of algorithms. And then finally, discipline. We have state medical boards to investigate complaints. We could think about analogous institutions to investigate safety issues and quality issues related to algorithms. So it's not a 100% perfect analogy, but when we think about what generative AI systems do versus what individual medical devices do, it actually probably makes a lot more sense to think about a notion closer to medical licensure than something as simple as medical device regulation. So it's a bit of a controversial proposal, but I will leave you with that. And I think we have a couple of minutes. Should there be any questions, or if you want to discuss anything, I'm open to use this remaining time however you would like. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ariel, for this very interesting talk. Are there questions? Cecian, I see you raise your hand.
Yes, can you see me?
Yes.
Yes, hi.
Hello, I'm Shishan. I'm a PhD in the I3h institution. And for the AI, we need a lot of data to train the AI. And especially after the post-market of these medical devices, there's a lot of data generated in the medical device. So my question is that, so after the post-market, what is the current regulation requirement for the data usage? Like where the data is stored and who can access this data, and for what purpose of this data can be used
Yeah,
after
so I
post-market?
think you're asking about software devices more generally, is that right?
Yes. Yes.
Yes. So there we have to just go back to local laws and jurisdictional requirements. So in Europe, of course, as it would be, this is data about health, so everything will be governed accordingly, by GDPR. We also in Europe, we have sort of this interesting tension between the General Data Protection Regulation and the AI Act. So in the case of AI tools, we have to think about both. Although something I'm excited about have been these recent calls to harmonize. Basically, there are actually some real points, and I'm not a lawyer, but my smarter friends than I am who are lawyers have pointed out that there are many places where the AI Act and the GDPR actually say something different than one another. Um, and you don't have to be a health lawyer in that case to conclude that this could be quite a deterrent for potential developers of new software and algorithms because they don't know how they will be regulated or based on which laws they'll be regulated. Um, but if you're talking about the actual reuse of data and metadata from digital medical devices, in Europe, we would have to fall back on the GDPR and ask questions about, was there consent by the patients for secondary data use? Under what circumstances? Can these data, if there wasn't consent, can the data be sufficiently anonymized such that we could nevertheless use or reuse the data for further R&D purposes? And we get very quickly into a very important but also very complex discussion that go back to data regulations. So I'll say, the projects that we're doing are, of course, in the research context with fully anonymized data sets, working closely with manufacturers. Data are stored on secured servers. Now thinking, this call is being recorded, so I'm glad I just said that out loud. But in Europe, we're at a massive disadvantage. So in the United States, it's much easier to use patient data, to reuse patient data. And this is something that we're working on. I think the European health data space, as it sort of slowly comes into force and existence, will be an exciting development and will, if it's built the way that I think those of us in research hope it will be built, will facilitate really meaningful data use, not only within but across European countries, but we're still a few years away from that.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia. Michelle, you have a question?
Yes, first of all, thank you. Thank you so much for this very interesting presentation. Well, coming back to the patients, I was wondering, for example, at the FDA, how much are the patients involved in the regulation? And do you think that indeed there are additional, I would say, initiative to be taken to really improve also the literacy of patients about AI and the use of AI in healthcare?
Yeah, so I'll say, the existing regulations we have now on both sides of the Atlantic, patients have not historically been very involved. I've attended a couple of medical device advisory committee meetings at the FDA, and there is typically always a patient representative involved in the discussion around any individual product. But I don't have any good reason to believe that patients are involved meaningfully in the regulations themselves. Like other regulations, these are written by bureaucrats and lawyers. I think to your second question, there's a massive opportunity, not just for patient literacy, but for healthcare provider literacy around AI. This is something, please ask me about this next year. This is something that we at the Hasso-Plattner Institute are actually working on, is thinking about how can we be part of the solution in this setting and actually provide continuing digital medical education and continuing AI medical education for healthcare professionals. So here in Germany, we have some of the oldest doctors in Europe. So our doctors are just very old. This is, there are a bunch of challenges around that. One is sort of the workforce transition. If you have a lot of doctors over 55, that means you have a lot of doctors that will be leaving the workforce in the next 10 years, which means that we may have an even greater clinician shortage. It also means that something like, I believe it's over 40% of the currently practicing doctors in Germany had completed the entirety of their medical education before the first iPhone had ever come to market. So that means that we have, well, what does that mean? It means that we have a lot of doctors who are exceptionally smart people. They went to medical school, they did training, many of them do research, But they were not, none of their medical training involved understanding digital tools. There were no diagnostic algorithms when they were going to medical school or doing their training or doing their specialties. And so my personal belief is that it's rather naive of us to be frustrated that, we can't just expect, oh, we'll bring all these wonderful digital tools to market and suddenly doctors and patients will understand what to do with them. No, that's not automatically true. We need to bring everyone along with us for the ride. So that means continuing medical education, in particular around digital tools and AI for clinicians. And it also involves helping patients understand, fight misinformation, of which there's a lot out there, and help patients be sort of thoughtful and informed patients. I have a PhD student here at my chair who herself is a patient advocate. And she's doing some wonderful research around basically digitally informed patients. Patients have tremendous opportunities to get much more information than they used to, but we also need to figure out how can we help patients to get high quality information, not just whatever they happen to stumble upon because they're in a Facebook group or a Reddit group. This is something I care very deeply about. One of our postdocs here, I was actually working on a project related to, can you provide just-in-time medical information in conjunction with patient forums? So many patients, especially patients with certain types of conditions, women's health and other stigmatized conditions among them, often go to patient forums for their information. And can you provide AI-based tools for the patients in the places they go to anyhow to help them get higher quality medical information? I think these are the types of opportunities that I find quite exciting, and I hope we see more of them over coming years. That was a lot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I see Antonio Estache and Philippe Khoury have a question. Caroline, can you promote them, please? Meanwhile, Ariel, can you explain? I might have missed it, but this AI doc, so it works as like a clearinghouse that has licenses and different types of diagnostic radiology devices.
Yes, that's right. So they've developed, at the time we wrote the case, they had 17 of their own radiology algorithms that were all licensed as medical devices. They aggregate those together and now also aggregate other authorized medical devices onto one platform. And then what happens is that a hospital that they're working with would have access to this whole platform, this whole portfolio of AI-supported diagnostics.
They can train those or interlink all those models and train them to become.
So each of these models is running separately. And this is actually, it's a great question because many clinicians I talk to, they're like, oh, well, if I use AI-based medical devices, I don't want my data or my patient's data going into the medical device. That doesn't happen. It actually can't happen. So even with machine learning-based medical devices, because of how we do regulation, an individual patient's data will be put into the algorithm and filtered against everything the algorithm knows about how to diagnose a certain condition. But unlike how ChatGPT works today with your data, the patient's data it flows in and out of the algorithm, but it doesn't become part of the machine learning algorithm itself. The algorithms themselves, they can be updated, but they're static. So at any given time, so if we were to take your data and my data and run the algorithm on the data, neither of our data would show up in the algorithm. If you want to reauthorize a medical device, you would have to go and actually retrain the algorithm. You would have to have a reason to believe that you could improve the diagnostic quality of the algorithm, and then you have to declare we're going to go out and with this very high quality data from another country, we're going to update the algorithm. But the types of AI-based devices we have on the market, both in Europe and the United States, they're not like changing every day, like other large language models you might engage with. They're static. So they're using very sophisticated machine learning and deep learning models, but they're not being updated with every use.
Okay. Thank you. Antonio?
That's a terrific question.
Thank you.
Yeah, actually, I wrote it down. Thanks a lot for this presentation. I learned a lot. But I do have one quick question. Do you think about the ethical dimension of, for instance, the certification process for AI?
Absolutely. So I'm not a medical ethicist. I enjoy working with medical ethicists. One would have to. I think I think let me say it differently. I think part of the challenge with the way that we're currently regulating medical AI is that to the extent we're thinking about medical ethics, we weren't thinking about medical ethics for algorithms when our current regulations were written. But any meaningful change to regulation, whether it's for certifying AI systems or anything else, would have to start from first principles. And you know, the sort of the basics, transparency, fairness. We have many good frameworks for how to think about this. In fact, I personally believe we have too many frameworks. You know, there are too many NGOs and think tanks out there that want to develop their own checklist or framework for responsible AI. And I think for companies, it's actually exquisitely challenging because many companies are in a position of, you know, wanting to do the right. Not all companies want to do the right thing, but those that do, they don't know, like, well, the World Health Organization has a framework and the OECD has a framework and many think tanks have ways to support this. And it's, you know, all these frameworks are coming from a place of really good intentions, but there's no dominant framework out there. But I applaud the fact that these frameworks exist. And of course, you know, for me, at least, it's obvious that any new tool we develop, any new regulatory framework we develop, any new regulatory policy we develop, should bake into account the principles that we think of as being most important in medical ethics, translated to AI. And so, you know, accountability, fairness, transparency, all of these
But
things.
as you do this, I mean, thinking about the data sets that you have, it'd be interesting to have a look at the extent to which there's a difference of the extent to which ethical considerations have been internalized into the algorithm compared to a situation in which they have not been internalized.
Yeah, it's a great. I mean,
be curious
I
to
think
see the.
so I don't know that you could get. So I agree completely. I don't know that we could get this from regulatory filings and product summaries. I think you would need to do code review of the actual algorithms to understand.
But it will make sense, and if it hasn't been done, maybe include that into an ex-ante evaluation decision, so that from now on things like this had been done. Because I think there is a risk of money leading to decisions which are not necessarily the greatest one for the patient.
Yeah, and there have been various
or for the taxpayer
calls,
for that matter.
Yeah, and there have been various calls just for more transparency. So you know, the unfortunately the bar is quite low right now. Many of the approved algorithms we have on the market, the approved medical devices, you know, don't have full transparency about training data. So just knowing what data these algorithms were trained on. If I'm going to, you know, I live in Berlin, if I'm going to a hospital in Berlin, I don't want to be treated by an algorithm that was entirely trained on patients in Florida. Like healthcare in Berlin and patients in Berlin look quite different than those in Florida. And so even just basic things like transparency, we still have quite a ways to go.
Thank you very much.
I think Philippe was next.
Hi, okay, February, I'm from Bordeaux University. I had a very interesting presentation, and I would say as a MD, I like your perspective regarding the parallel you make between human versus AI certification. That's very good shot. I have a just very simple question regarding my interest in orphan drugs. Does the FDA breakthrough medical device mentioned are preferentially linked or not with rare disease indication?
Sorry, the connection is not so good. I'm not sure I fully understood the question. So FDA?
Does the FDA breakthrough medical device are preferentially linked or not with rare disease indication?
So I know that there are special reviews when a rare disease is involved. There are regulatory programs. The thing that I don't know about, but now that's been brought up twice, I will go and look at the data. Are how many of the AI devices are for rare diseases? I don't have a number for you on that.
Okay.
But it's knowable.
Okay, thank you.
And then we have a last question. Thank you, Ariel, from Josse. Josse, please.
Well, I read with great interest your recent article in JAMA about AI as a potential medical practitioner. And I was wondering, will that in the near future impact seriously the labor market for healthcare professionals, you think?
I think in the near future, no. And I think And again, there's so much to think through if we want to take seriously a notion of AI licensure. But I think, our goal with this article was just to point out the ways in which the concept of medical licensure just makes a lot more sense in certain settings than simply individual regulatory clearances. In the near future, I don't think this will be a problem. In the medium future, I also don't see this impacting. My hope for AI is that we get to a place where we have figured out what are the set of tasks that AI is really good at, both in diagnosis and treatment recommendations. And that allows us to use our existing clinicians much more efficiently. Something we didn't have time to talk about is the category that I excluded from all the regulatory stuff, which is administrative work. The average hospital in the United States has 1.2 administrative workers for every medical professional. So, there's just a lot of paperwork involved in medicine. And, I think what we're already starting to see and what I hope for more of in the near future is using AI to do just very low-hanging fruit activities like administrating the documentation, reducing the documentation burden for nurses. Nurses spend so much of their time just doing paperwork, a lot of which is actual paperwork on pieces of paper. What if we could have even half of that time given back to the nurses to actually provide care for people? That would be wonderful. So I think I'm cautiously optimistic that we could do much more on the administrative side. And then with diagnosis and treatment, I hope that we get to a place where we have very high quality evidence about what algorithms can do well so that we can use clinician time for the things like caring for patients that algorithms don't do well. Algorithms are not good at looking you in the eye and showing empathy for your pain. They're not good at certain types of diagnoses. And so let's all specialize in what we're good at. Oh, I'm looking at the time. I think we should probably wrap up. I suspect I have somebody waiting outside of my office as well.
Okay. I would
Thank you.
really like to thank you, Professor Stern. Thank you, Ariel. Thank you, Sophia, for connecting us. Your work is really remarkable, and I learned a lot. I think we all did. Thank you so much for being with us. Please, later today, we will share the invitation for next week, a seminar given by Sana Akadat on rare diseases. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Be well.